For this part of the lecture, we're going to turn our attention to the subcontinent of India. Some parts of the world, such as India, became much more involved in the emerging technologically oriented culture than others, such as sub-Saharan Africa. The consequences of this inequality of access to, quote, modern developments are still felt today. Under British rule, India acquired railroads, harbors, modern cities, and cotton and steel mills as an active and worldly middle class. The economic transformation of the region awakened in the new middle class a sense of national dignity that demanded political fulfillment. In response, the British gradually granted India limited political autonomy while maintaining overall control. Despite periodic famines, notably between 1896 to 1900 when 2 million people died of starvation, the Indian population grew from 250 million in 1900 to 319 million in 1921 and 389 million in 1941. Just for perspective, I think the United States is at about 330 million today. This growth caused landless young men to converge on the cities, exceeding the number of jobs available in the slowly expanding industries. Many of them entered the urban economy as rickshaw pullers. To produce timber for construction and railroad ties and to clear land for tea and rubber plantations, foresters cut down most of the tropical hardwood forests that had covered the subcontinent in the 19th century. In spite of the deforestation and extensive irrigation, the amount of land available to peasant families shrank with each generation. Economic development hardly benefited the average Indian. After paying rent to landowners, interest to village moneylenders, and taxes to government, peasants, always the great majority, had little left to improve their land or raise their standard of living. The government protected property owners, from village moneylenders, all the way up to the Maharajas, or ruling princes, who owned huge tracts of land. The cities were crowded with craftsmen, traders, and workers of all sorts, mostly very poor. Although the British banned the practice of widow burning, women's lives in India changed little under British rule. Indians also spoke many different languages. As a result of British rule, increasing trade and travel, and newspapers like the Times of India, English became the common medium of communication for the Western-educated middle class. This new class of English-speaking bureaucrats, professionals, and merchants played a leading role in the Indian independence movement. The majority of Indians practiced Hinduism and were subdivided into hundreds of castes, each affiliated with a particular occupation. Hinduism discouraged intermarriage and other social interactions among the castes and non-Hindus. Until displaced by the British in the 19th century, Muslim rulers had dominated northern and central India. Muslims now constituted 1/4 of the Indian population, but formed a majority in the northwest and in eastern Bengal. They felt discriminated against by both British and Hindus. At the turn of the century, most Indians accepted British rule, but the Europeans' racist attitude toward dark-skinned people increasingly offended the Indians, who had learned English and absorbed English ideas of freedom and representative government, only to find out that racial quotas excluded them from the Indian civil service, the officer corps, and prestigious country clubs. In 1885, a small group of English-speaking Hindu professionals founded a political organization called the Indian National Congress. For 20 years, its members respectfully petitioned the government for access to higher administrative positions and for a voice in official decisions, but they had little influence. Then, in 1905, the Viceroy, who's the British guy in charge of India, divided the province of Bengal into 2 parts to improve the efficiency of its administration. Made without consulting anyone, this decision angered educated Indians, but also millions of Hindu Bengalis who found themselves outnumbered by Muslims in East Bengal. Muslims, fearful of Hindu dominance elsewhere, founded the Muslim League in 1906. The government responded by granting Indians a limited franchise based on wealth. Muslims, however, were on average poorer than Hindus, possibly because many poor and low-caste Hindus converted to Islam to escape caste discrimination. Accordingly, the British instituted separate representation and different voter qualifications. During the First World War, more than 2 million Indians fought on behalf of the British. War was over, a freedom movement led by the Indian National Congress and the Muslim League were expecting a payoff. In 1917, Britain announced, quote, the gradual development of self-governing institutions with a view to the progressive realization of responsible government in India as an integral part of the British Empire." End quote. This sounded like a promise of self-government, but the timetable was so vague that nationalists denounced it as a devious maneuver to postpone India's independence. The truth was that Britain was not ready to relinquish their Indian colony despite the Great War's ideals of nationalism and self-determination for people and countries. In March 1919, the British Parliament passed a law known as the Rowlatt Act to try to prevent Indian nationalists from organizing against the British government there. The Rowlatt Act gave the police the power to arrest any person without any reason at all. The act authorized the government to imprison, without a trial, any person suspected of terrorism, or what might be called revolutionary activity. The Rowlatt Act also restricted the media and denied people accused of revolutionary activity the right to know who accused them, the evidence against them, and also, this act meant that people could be arrested without warrants. Both Hindu and Muslim nationalists spoke out against the Rowlatt Act. April 6th, Indians basically went on strike in protest against the law. Indians refused to work and held meetings against the act and prayed for its repeal. Some officials resigned from the Indian legislature to protest the act. In response to these protests, 2 leaders of the Indian Congress were arrested and deported. On April 13th, an English general in charge of Punjab banned all meetings and gatherings. That day happened to be the day of a Sikh festival. Villagers gathered to celebrate the festival, which turned into a protest against the deportation of those leaders in the Indian Congress. General Reginald Dyer ordered his troops to fire into the peaceful crowd of demonstrators, killing almost 400 and injuring 11,000 people, and some estimates range as high as killing 1,000 people. This is called the Jallianwala Bagh Massacre. It's also known as the Amritsar Massacre. How did Britain respond to this massacre? The House of Lords voted to approve of Dyer's actions and raised money in appreciation of his services. The House of Commons in Parliament, kind of like their House of Representatives, censured him, banned from working in India ever again, charged with any crimes because he was a soldier acting on orders. 20 years, violent uprisings and harsh repression seemed imminent. That the worst did not come to pass was in part due to Mohandas Gandhi. Gandhi was born into a middle-class life, was educated in England, and became a lawyer. He spent 20 years in South Africa as an attorney, and it would be here that he got his first taste of peaceful protest. South Africa, of course, was segregated in the apartheid system. Well, Gandhi rode a train, and a white passenger refused to ride in the same carriage as him. Gandhi refused to move and was thrown off the train. Gandhi then founded a newspaper and organized a branch of the Indian Congress in South Africa. Eventually, he returned to India, where he joined the Indian National Congress. Like many radical political thinkers of the time, Gandhi denounced the popular ideals of power, struggle, and combat. Inspired by Christian and Hindu beliefs in nonviolence, Gandhi preached ahimsa, nonviolence, and satyagraha, the search for the truth. Even when situations devolved into violence around him, he remained steadfast and called off demonstrations if they turned violent. In 1921, Gandhi gave up the Western-style suits worn by lawyers and henceforth wore a simple peasant garb. He spoke for the poor and downtrodden who had been most devastated by colonial rule. His followers came to revere him, and he transformed the cause of Indian independence from an elite movement to a mass movement. Gandhi was a brilliant political tactician and a master of public relations. He also knew how to use new media. In 1929, he led followers for an 80-mile walk, camped on a beach, and gathered salt from the sea in a blatant and well-publicized act of civil disregard for the government's monopoly on salt. Gandhi's Salt March inspired demonstrations across India. British authorities arrested over 60,000 demonstrators in the wake of these protests. Many times during the 1930s, he threatened to fast until death, and several times he came close to dying, to protest the violence of both the police and his followers to demand independence. He was repeatedly arrested and spent a total of 6 years in jail. Every arrest made him more popular. He became an iconic figure, not only in his own country, but in Western media as well. Gandhi was in many ways a symbolic leader. His influence can't be denied, but the biggest nationalist leader of the Indian people, or at least for Indian Hindus, was Jawaharlal Nehru. Nehru wanted to create a modern industrial India. Despite winning elections, the British viceroy shut out the Indians from any voice in governance. When World War II broke out, Gandhi urged Indian neutrality. It wasn't that he liked fascism or Nazism, but rather he didn't think that Indians should fight for an imperialist, colonialist regime against an equally disagreeable philosophy. When the British offered to give India its independence after the war for its support in fighting, Gandhi led the Quit India campaign for immediate full independence. Despite Gandhi's call for neutrality, about 2 million Indians served in the Allied war effort. While Gandhi preached neutrality, Indian Muslim League leader Muhammad Ali Jinnah supported the war effort. Jinnah hoped that in securing Indian independence, he could secure a nation-state for Indian Muslims. In the 1937 elections, the Indian National Congress refused to share power with the Muslim League. As independence approached, talks between Jinnah and Nehru broke down and violent rioting between Hindus and Muslims broke out. Gandhi's appeals for tolerance fell on deaf ears. The British, who had united India through railroads and a common language for the middle class, would ultimately sever the country. In truth, however, the British government set the stage for this showdown. Beginning in the first census of India, the British decided that the most logical way to categorize the people there would be first by religion, second by civil condition, third by age, fourth by birthplace and language, fifth by occupation, and sixth by education. That was in 1881. Generations of this breakdown, first by religion, had its consequences. England worried that any British officials in India already had a stake in the fight between the Hindus and Muslims. They didn't want to put a Hindu or a Muslim at the head of decision-making because of racism and bias in the process of partitioning the country. For the Indian Boundary Committee, the British called up someone who had never been to India and who hated all Indians. Sir Cyril Radcliffe headed the Indian Boundary Committee, and over the course of 5 or 6 weeks, he and his committee determined the fates of millions of people. He basically looked at a bunch of maps and drew lines around where the Muslim majority places were, and determined that in northern India, at those strongholds, that's where the boundary should be for the Muslim state of Pakistan. It turned out to create one state divided across east and west. Today there's only one Pakistan because East Pakistan became Bangladesh. The partition of India had huge consequences. 12 million people found themselves on the wrong side of the borders. It produced the largest migration in the short amount of time, and nearly 1 million people died in this movement. One man, a Hindu Indian, recalled that growing up, quote, "We were very wealthy and had lots of things in our house. We had milk and our own livestock. Nehru gave away our area to Pakistan. Then Muslims then started to slaughter the Hindus and Sikhs. The Muslims in our village said, 'We won't let you stay here. This is Pakistan. Go to Lahore camp.' There was a camp in Lahore. They said they'd leave us near that. They took everyone out of the house to the well and killed them. There were 17 people from my house killed." End quote. In 1947, India earned its independence, as did Pakistan, but the divorce between the countries put them on different paths of development and shaky relations, to put it at the very least. They have fought several wars, produced nuclear weapons, and are still fighting over the territory of Kashmir. Nehru became the first Prime Minister for India, and Muhammad Ali Jinnah became the first Prime Minister for Pakistan. Gandhi was assassinated in 1948, but left a legacy in India as a spiritual and political leader. He also left a legacy in the United States and South Africa. Martin Luther King Jr. carried Gandhi's nonviolent strategy to the civil rights movement, and his anti-Vietnam stance and the Poor People's Campaign, his last major effort. Nelson Mandela, a follower of nonviolence, was awarded India's highest honor for his efforts to defeat apartheid. Alright, so in the next lecture, we're going to take a look at some of the limits of all this modernization and looking at how some countries in South America and Sub-Saharan Africa fared during this time.